Well, welcome back to number 2 in the story of money. Just remember last week we finished up with Kaleki's fable and the idea of money as about trusted relationships, which is measured. So the idea of money as inscribed trust. So today we are looking at an ongoing and ever reported problem. This idea of avarice, this desire for wealth. Is the desire for wealth or more wealth wrong? Well, obviously, if you were poor, I don't think so. But what is poor today was rich 100 years ago. It's quite strange. So striving to be richer isn't necessarily an issue. And we're going to talk about wealth improvement and all of the philosophies underneath that. So, I want to start here with this artwork, which is in the Smithsonian Institute. It's a piece called Filthy Lucre, and it's a work by Darren Waterston. So there's actually a story about this. This is actually a quasi-replica of a room that actually did exist in Victorian England. And the story behind it was that James Whistler, the famous American artist, as in Whistler's mother, the famous American artist, went to London, and in 1876 he was approached by a very, very wealthy client who wanted to improve his position in society, and he wanted, James Whistler to produce a room that was immensely beautiful, more than, with gold and diamonds and all that sort of stuff everywhere. And Whistler took on the contract and produced a room full of gold. It was called the Peacock Room, and ironically, the client hated it. And so he sent Whistler back to fix it up. Whistler was upset and put in more stuff that the client hated. And yes, it was as a famous expression. Whistler's mother pulled her son aside and said, "Go and paint stuff that people like and make some money." And this room in the Smithsonian Institute is a take on that. It's a replica, but as you can see, everything is broken and distorted. And it's really a commentary about wealth and money. Because why would someone create this peacock room just with so much wealth, so much money in it, just simply to try and improve his position in society? It was total wastefulness with so much poverty, especially in 19th century England. So today, this begins our journey on money. It's a love-hate relationship. We have our modern equivalent, and I'll play this for you, and you'll know it very, very quickly.
The point is, ladies and gentlemen, that greed, for lack of a better word, is good. Greed is right. Greed works. Greed clarifies, cuts through, and captures the essence of the evolutionary spirit. Greed in all of its forms. Greed for life, for money, for love, knowledge, has marked the upward surge of mankind, and greed, you mark my words, will not only save Teldar Paper, but that other malfunctioning corporation called the USA. Thank you very much.
Enough. I'm sure a lot of you will remember that. that scene from that movie, the the Wolf of Wall Street. But is this fear of money, of the stain from comes from it, as expressed by that, is this fear irrational? Where does a desire for simple improvement in one's living standards cross the boundary to greed? The idea is being spoken about there by Gordon Gekko there in the movie. It's really just a reflection of a very famous work by Adam Smith called The Wealth of Nations, written and published in 1776. That is, acting in our own interests is the most efficient way of organising societies. Now, that's not quite what Gordon Gekko said, and you can start to see that there is a subtlety in difference. The idea of building up money is not an evil thing, and it's certainly not a new idea. But from time immemorial, man's propensity to build up assets, to lord it over other men, well, often for their own good, by the way, as perceived by those in power, this idea of lording it over others has always been seen to be evil. So you lead to this paradox. It really is a paradox. So Western society, which is really built on individual greed, these societies have generally become healthy places to live in. People do care for each other. At the same time, racing ahead in competitiveness to outdo each other and become richer. And at the same time, the 20th century showed plenty of examples where societies that tried to work towards a shared national idea and manage people have become just abhorrent societies of the greatest extremes. So you have, for example, in the 20th century, probably the worst case is Japanese culture through the 20s and 30s, which became effectively a welfare state. And the whole idea of the welfare state is that people were primed for war. I'm not sure whether many people are aware of that. Japan, in attacking USA in 1941 at Pearl Harbor, now that was really the back end of what had been happening for 20 years before that. And some people say it's actually their peak, and after that it declined. Japan saw itself as the society, and that's why it had a plan to literally take over all of Southeast Asia. And they started with China and Burma and down through all there. And they were very warlike. But it was a society where everyone worked towards a shared national goal. And that goal was to take over the rest of the world. It really was true. But not just that. We had communist Russia where everyone was equal, but it's quite clear that some were more equal than others. And the German nationalism, where everyone worked together to overcome what was probably the injustice of war reparations from the First World War. And they came together, and of course, Nazis and so on. Yeah, the point is, if you want to control money, then you must control people. And that's not a good thing if you value freedom. So you've got this paradox, and really it's not been resolved. But I want to turn back to the medieval world. And this is fascinating because it was a totally different world. Things that we take for granted today just didn't exist. So we go back, say, the Middle Ages, 12th century. So Europe it didn't have any big countries. It was literally city-states. And they were constantly fighting each other. Each had their own money or currency. And of course, the only thread that pulled them together was the Catholic Church. But money didn't go anywhere, and for several reasons. First was arithmetic, because everything was still in Roman numerals. Now, you can do addition in Roman numerals, but after that, if you do calculations with percentages and so on, no one could do it, except for a few small number of people who were highly sought after. So people could inscribe basic things about what was owed, but calculations involving fractions and so on, just about impossible. Secondly, the Catholic Church had declared usury, which is basically charging interest, as a sin of the highest order. I mean, if you were a usurist, that is, lent money out and expecting to get more back in return, you were denied burial. And it wasn't just Christianity and Catholicism, it was the same in Islam. Riba, which is the same idea as usury, banned. In fact, this word usury has the root to use. And so the way the Catholic Church saw, and the Muslims, the way they saw usury was that when you took money, lent money and expected more return, that was using other people, taking advantage of the work of others. Strange enough, the Jews were exempt because they could lend. They also had laws against usury, but only to Jews. They could lend to Gentiles. And you can thus see the reason why that was spied. Not because they were Jews and rich, that's part to do with it, but because they were usurists, people who were denied burial, literally, in their own in the culture in which they lived. They were wicked people. Well, at least at those times. But the other thing in the medieval world, and it was a really big problem that we just don't talk about, is that people were locked into their situations. If you were poor, then there was no way you could get money to improve yourself, to go and build something and build a furnace and improve your blacksmithing business. No, you had to just live with what you had inherited. You couldn't borrow, other than some wealthy relative coming along and gifting you money. Conversely, lending money wasn't worthwhile because there was no reward for risks. Though the Catholic system said yes, people should expend all these risks for others, not expecting return, which is an interesting view. And you can run societies like that. But people acted in their own interests, and so because risks were not rewarded, people just tended to hold on to their money. So the economy was, without question, depressed. It wasn't going anywhere. So let's talk a little bit more about usury. And the word is riba in Muslim cultures. It's about paying returns on money invested. Loans in Quranic culture, Muslim culture, and also in Christian culture were to be free. But, as I've got one quote here, I can't remember who it was from. The quote says, "The sad reality of modern life throughout much of the world is that usury is so pervasive and fundamental to the fabric of an economy and society that few think of it as anything but ordinary and necessary. In fact, it is an evil invention and the great economic and spiritual downfall of capitalist society." Fascinating quote. It shows you both sides. Could we actually create a society where people were good enough to actually give away their money, risk it, so sometimes the money didn't come back, as a good deed to society? Interesting question. Certainly in those times, usurists were despised. And in Dante, in his Divine Comedy, sets aside the lowest part of hell, the very worst part, for usurists. It's a little bit more complicated, though, and there is the time issue of money. That is, when we loan, aren't we renting our money? When we loan out, say, for example, a piece of equipment that we might have, it might be very valuable. Shouldn't we get a sort of rent fee because we don't have use of that equipment at that time. So isn't it just and fair that someone pay us for when we lend our piece of equipment to someone else? And people would argue that money is just another piece of equipment. We should get rewarded for not using our money now, giving it to someone else who can pay us later back. Interesting. Luke chapter 6 in the Bible, in verses 34 to 36, talks about, if you lend to those from whom you expect repayment, what credit is that to you? Even sinners lend to sinners. These raise interesting questions about whether we could not create different types of society. But back to the Middle Ages. Here's a picture of Leonardo of Pisa, commonly called Fibonacci. He's very famous for probably a couple of things. The Fibonacci number sequence. He's a bit of an amateur mathematician. Where the next number in the sequence is the sum of the previous two, and has that sequence. And as in mathematics, the two quantities are in the golden ratio. And as you get further and further and further, it gets closer and closer to that golden mean, which is 1.618, etc. That's a mathematical thing. Very famous for that. But he's also famous for working in introducing or eliminating Roman numerals and introducing our current decimal system from India. So these Arabic numerals, you can suddenly start to do far more complex calculations. And so he was able to develop tables of repayment schedules based on interest rates. That is, that lenders could work on a cost of money and base that on interest rates, and suddenly you can have tables of repayment schedules which lenders could use. But usury was still banned. That didn't stop it. This is a famous painting from Botticelli in the 15th century, 1476, The Adoration of the Magi. And this is fascinating. In the picture, the three wise men and all the people watching around are all people from well-known Florentine families, particularly the Medici family. So paintings like this were always done with clergy and saints all appearing in these sorts of images. But suddenly have a look close on the left-hand side, you can see that it's got a very European Roman background. It's not Israel where Jesus is born. And of course, it's not kings or prophets or priests that are in the picture. It's what were to become bankers. So what's gone on? This is a fascinating picture. So lending at interest did occur. And of course, some people just did it and were ostracized and sometimes even jailed. But Medicis were very clever, though. They had an out because you couldn't charge interest. But if you were doing a foreign currency transaction, and remember that every city-state had a different currency, so literally, if you were dealing with business outside the city, you were dealing with a foreign currency. So if you were dealing in foreign currency, then these usuries rules didn't apply because you could start charging transaction fees. Okay, this is not interest or usury. This is just a transaction fee, but it was an interest. It was a crack in the law, and it opened up quite widely because most commercial transactions fell into this category. It was a loophole. Risky business. I mean, 3 Florentine families were wiped out in the 1340s because they had done some business with the King of England. He just defaulted and refused to pay back the money. And so those Florentine families were wiped out. But there was one family, the Medici family, who became super powerful. And they became super powerful because they were big. And they could ride out things such as the Bank of the King of England not repaying his debts. So the Medici family became very famous in many places within Europe. They spread their tentacles far and wide. And they would sit at their benches in prominent parts of town, and people would come to them to borrow money for their various international transactions. Now, ironically, their benches were actually called banks, and so you can see where we get the modern term. Now, up until this time, kings were the power brokers. They owned and controlled the people around them. Now we have the Medici. And because they were the mediators of risk, lending and borrowing, so they ended up being the true controllers. The rulers and kings lost power to families like the Medici, who controlled the money market. The kings thought they were in control, moving people around to their whim, whereas the Medici were quite different. They were joint partners. You want some money to extend your wealth and borrow and build stuff? Then you come and talk to the Medici family. And that's why we have this painting from Botticelli, set not in a stable, but in the ruins of ancient Rome. So Rome falling, Christianity rising, all sorts of themes in this painting. Fascinating. Let's take a segue here. Of course, people say, well, stop. This doesn't make any sense. What about the defaulters? The King of England just refused to pay back his money. As you can see, this little cartoon, if your check is in the mail, please ignore this reminder. What did you do when someone defaulted? So these days, money flows everywhere. Very few would consider usury wrong. That's basically lending money, because we see money as being, basically a rental fee if you borrow it. Although after the GFC, questions have been raised. So what about the people who just default on their obligations? You have your loan sharks, and we saw Shylock last week getting his pound of flesh. But the strange thing is, say for example, USA, the rate of bankruptcies is enormous, and yet it still remains a wealthy society. People who just default on their debts can just walk away. Okay, there are some implications, but they don't get beaten up, they don't get put in jail. They're marked as defaulters, of course, and that's a problem, but still, that's not forever, and they can get back into business eventually. And yet, really, it's still a wealthy society. Wouldn't the money all be wasted with defaulters? And, well, history tells us no. And then you've got these questions about egalitarianism or equality. If people are to flourish, then it seems that money has to flow. And when money flows, that's never going to be equal. And of course, that has some people worried. So some people call for equality, usually via forced means like progressive taxation. And that's fair enough. But Adam Smith, in his book praising the rise of self-interest as a way of making money and keeping society healthy, even Adam Smith was to say, no society can surely be flourishing and happy of which the far greater part of the members are poor and miserable. Right. Okay, so you got this question of whether we have egalitarian societies where everyone's got the same opportunity, okay, and people are lifted up that are in need, or societies which are equal, okay, which is forced by the government. So in Australia, for example, 50% of income tax revenue comes from the top 10% of people. It might be a little bit higher now. So what are we going to do with that? Obviously, we don't have equality in Australia by no means. do we want to make income tax even more progressive? I mean, it's not going to work. You're going to, even if you made it 100% of tax comes from the top 10%. I mean, and it's pointed out by economists like Thomas Sowell that whenever you increase taxes on the rich, you end up with less tax income. Why? That seems bizarre, but that's history, and there are lots of reasons for that because it has a lot of when you change that, the rich feel as if they're being attacked, and they start changing their affairs, and there are lots of other reasons as well. So creating equality is very difficult unless you become a communist society where everyone is equal. Well, not quite. So this is a fascinating chart. And this has been spoken about a lot because some people just look at the very far right of each graph. So up top is today's world, which is labelled dromedary world, and we're looking back to 1973. So that's 50 years ago. And people just look at the right-hand side and they look at the number of rich people in 1973 versus the number of rich people in 2010. The number of rich people, especially really rich people, has skyrocketed, absolutely skyrocketed, because it's coming off such a small base. But in the bigger picture, they're not that, it's not that larger percentage of people. And what people ignore is this big group on the left. Okay, at the bottom you can see that this huge bulk of people are living on a few dollars a day, and suddenly it's shifted. The bulk of people is now up to $10+ a day. So that's in real, and this is in real terms. Suddenly, people, basically the poor have tripled their wealth. Still not very much in some terms, but it's had a vast impact on society. People are slowly being lifted out of poverty. This is 2010, and it has continued. Interesting questions. But let's have a look at the politics, and we'll go back now in time again. Not back to the Middle Ages, back to the Dutch East India Company, where, well, it's the rise of Dutch church policy, allowing faith to take a back seat and become a private feeling separate to societal governance. Fascinating. In many ways, this resolved a lot of the interfaith disputes because this time you have Protestant and Catholics and so on. But this idea that one's faith got expressed in private feelings, okay, Enlightenment stuff, okay, led to the rise of the Dutch East India Company. What happened is the Dutch stopped fighting over religious matters, Catholics versus Protestants, and they went shopping. That became the grand new scheme of things. It's, in a sense, this has continued on today. The Dutch built ships, sent them off into all sorts of places, in particular the Indonesia and India and all China and all these sorts of places where they did lots of trade, very much in the interests of Dutch rather than the people who they were trading with. And suddenly people quickly forgot the fact that these people they were visiting were poor and terribly impoverished, and we were just stripping stuff out of there for our own interests. So you can start to see the ugliness of money coming to the fore. And this has continued on into today in many ways. Not so bad though, perhaps. Or some people might look at this graph. So this is a chart showing the inequity between various people of various ages. So they've used 1989 as a sort of a year in which we start where they declared everyone equal. But as you can see, as we've moved through the last 50 years or 40 years, that there is now huge discrepancies between the wealth of young people and the wealth of old people. And this has become a hot topic of contemporary discussion. So there's many people, some people, especially young people, but not necessarily, a lot of old people would agree with it, would just simply say this is proof that, we have to do something or other, that the rich have to disperse their money to the young. And there's a point to that. However, there are other points to consider. For example, let's be honest. Young spend faster than the young 40 years ago. 40 years ago, people saved, really stretched out to buy houses and put it into property and invest and so on. That was far more common than it is now. We can argue about why that is, but that's a major reason for that, the difference. But probably the biggest reason is the change in life expectancy. Back in 89, you died when you were 70, so you retired at 65, and then you were dead within 5 years, quite commonly. So yeah, some people lasted to the hundreds, but it was very uncommon. Most people were dead within 5-6 years of their retiring. So they didn't need any wealth to keep them going. They just relied on the age pension just to keep them going. But that's not the case today. And what's happened is people are still retiring at 65 and are living on for another 20 years, not 5 years. And so there's this need to support themselves. Now, the government has started superannuation back in the 90s because they could see this problem coming. And Paul Keating and so on, very clever man, introduced superannuation as a means to get the old people, the young people then, to save up for their old age so that they didn't have to rely on the age pension. Now, that hasn't quite worked yet, although it's coming. There's still a lot of self-funded retirees about that just don't rely on the government, but most people still come to the government now. But it's hoped that in the future that it'll improve, and maybe some government rule changes, and they will make old people look after themselves. So old people have lots of money because they've got a lot of superannuation. And again, it's not wealth; it's money that they need in order to live off of. Okay, since they can't work. In a sense, they're cash rich. Asset rich, but cash poor. Okay, and that's the case with houses. They've all got houses because they bought them a long time ago. And well, again, you can't eat your house, although that's changing. Some people are selling up on various schemes to sell their house in future, and then getting money stream now. That's becoming more and more common. But yeah, interesting questions. It's not so simple. I showed this picture from the 17th century. This is a painting of the tulip mania of 1630s. Because this idea of lending and borrowing and taking on grand ventures can get out of control. And it has in a number of cases. And this is the most famous of all, the tulip mania, because people decided that tulips were a good investment medium because the value of tulip bulbs was increasing and increasing. People loved tulips coming from the Dutch, and the Dutch were quite happy to sell them. And so people found them a great asset to invest in, and it just got out of hand until the best tulips were being traded around 10 times the annual wage. That was absolutely crazy. And in fact, one rare tulip bulb traded for 12 acres of land. Crazy. These things, these what we call bubbles, just crash. And we have them today, property markets in some countries. Not Australia's got a different history, but there are property markets that have bubbles. But for Australians and Americans, it would be the IT bubbles, where people that invest, and there's so much promise and hope, and some it just falls flat. Yeah, we still have bubbles. So, what do we make of all this? And I'm going to tell the story from the Bible, but I'm going to tell it this is a more contemporary retelling of the story in an attempt to actually understand what probably went on, because the traditional translation of this story in the Bible in Luke 16 is, I think, probably vastly misunderstood, and it's affected the way we translate it. For example, you have little titles in most people's Bibles calling it the unjust manager, or the dishonest manager is often the title that's given. Yet there is nothing in the text to suggest that. So I'm going to tell you, this is my version of it, but it's based on some newer ideas that have come to the fore. And hopefully it will turn your head, because I think this is probably a good way of looking at this whole problem of wealth. So, you probably all remember the story about the dishonest manager, as it's often translated, and Jesus at the end saying, "You are to either love God or money." Let's have a look. The story. There is this master, and he owns a lot of capital, vast land holdings. Now that's strange, because in Israel that's not supposed to happen, because it's kept within families. They inherit and so on. But this is, a century, a millennium after all these things were put in place, and the whole system's unwound, and we find that there are Jews who have vast land holdings, and that's allowed for in the Levitical law, but it's frowned upon. But anyhow, that's the reality. And in order to make money on that, he has tenants on his land. So these are poor people who haven't inherited any land to grow their crops on. So they have to come to this rich landholder and ask him to use his land, and they will pay him a certain negotiated amount. It could be that it's an area where olives will grow very well, so they'll have to send him, 100 litres of olive oil every season as the payment for borrowing the land. That's his rent, as it were. And because he has so much land, he has a manager. And the role of that manager is to go around and make sure everyone pays, etc., etc. Just keeping a lid on things to make sure it all works well, that the tenants are actually using his land well, and that he's got everything, all this income going to be coming in. And an accusation is made against this man that he is wasting the master's resources. So the big thing about that is it's bringing dishonor to the rich master, because this is an honor society. Okay, we have to remember that. That's the first point. We forget in West that this was a culture that was all about honor. And having an employee who was wasting your resources brought dishonor to the rich master. So when he went to the city gate, people would say, "Ha, yeah, another loss, eh?" Yeah. So this steward, this manager, may not have been acting criminally. He just may not have been effective enough in making enough profit. So this whole thing is really uncertain. To say that he was a bad guy, as we often do in the normal retelling of the story, is just not supported by the texts, nor by understanding the culture that lived in. Anyhow, the steward gets sacked. Now, the steward's very clever and realizes that he is in a lose-lose situation. He's in a bad way. But he turns it around. And he does that by taking on something which was well known and advocated in those days, but not practiced by wealthy people. And that was debt reduction. People were talking about debt reduction way back then. We're talking 2,000 years ago. People were talking about debt reduction because as you read the story, what had happened is that there had been obviously some bad and lean years, and people couldn't pay their rent, and so they had worked up debts, which the master had graciously granted via the steward. And yeah, those debts were building up. So, this is a risky venture, but the steward, the manager says, this is what I'm going to do. So he races out to all these debtors who are farming the land and says, okay, I'm going to do some debt forgiveness. How much do you owe? 500 barrels of olive oil? Make it 250. Oh, thank you very much. Times will get good. We'll pay it back. Wow, this is really good. You're welcome in my house anytime. Okay. And he goes around and there's all this debt forgiveness. Now, the master was maybe not all that happy. But the next day when the master approaches the city gate, there are all the city leaders welcoming him in, saying, we have heard your program of debt reduction. This is wonderful. Welcome in. You're such a wonderful person. His honour is escalated off the charts. And suddenly the manager realises the futility of acquiring wealth and not being generous. And so everyone wins. The steward is well known for his debt forgiveness program, okay, and highly regarded amongst a lot of people, not necessarily amongst the wealthy, but amongst a whole lot of people. And he's welcome, and he'll get another employment fairly quickly. The rich man, who's the real bad guy in this story, well, suddenly his honour is beyond. He has got the best thing ever. So the lesson about this whole story, as told this way, is that we need to look beyond the balance sheet. People of the world know how to use money to benefit themselves. Or perhaps we should look at money as we need to look at all the parties involved, not just ourselves. So that we should be looking at the whole business venture. So the manager should be looking at not just his bottom line, but the bottom line of all the tenants. Because you can actually get a win-win out of all this. So, if money is trust inscribed, and that's our definition of money, then these situations require relationship management, which is what the manager, the steward, was so good at doing. And the landowner was just hopeless. Now, that's an emerging contemporary view of society. And it's actually rooted back in this story, though we don't read it that way. I think this is a way we should be reading the parable of the unjust manager who wasn't unjust. Let's give a different story to finish up today. And it's called Grandfather's Pennies. And a bit of a long story, but you'll get another perspective about wealth and money. So there was this family. Every month, Julia, and who was a child in this family, and her cousins would go for the big family meal at their grandfather's house once a month. And all the children, all the cousins would wait expectantly for the moment their grandfather would come out and give them a penny each and saying, you can buy yourself something. Go off, have a good time. And they went off and bought lollies. And their parents weren't very happy about this. This is not good because they went to see the grandparents and said, look, our children are never going to learn to manage money if you give it to them like this. So they came up with a scheme. Let's create a special test. So let's see which children would have the most money over the course of a year. So you give them their pennies each month, and let's see who has the most money. We'll have a competition amongst all the cousins. Let's see who has the most money. at the end of the year. So the competition started. So some of the children thought, oh, well, we better start saving our money in order to win this competition. But, there were a couple of children, Ruben and Nico, the two smallest kids actually, they paid no attention. They went out and they spent their money on sweets. And every time, each month, they would come back in after getting their penny, and they would show all the other kids right in front of them, look, we've got all these sweets. Bad luck for you, saving all your money. This made some of the children quite angry. And, they just couldn't stand it any longer, so they stopped saving their money and went and spent it on sweets the next month. And so this group of people who just spent it just grew. But there was a clever boy, Monty his name was, and he decided to start managing his money by buying and selling, or betting it with other children in card games. And soon enough, after a few months, he surprised his family and he accumulated quite a lot of money. And everyone was saying he's going to end up a rich man. But he wasn't very careful. And at the end of the 12 months, he had got himself involved in more and more risky deals, and he blew it all on one bet at the end. Everything lost. And yet, there was another cousin, Alex. He had a will of iron. He just saved all the money he was given. He says, I'm going to win this by just saving all the money. And what happened at the end of 12 months, he had the most, and he managed at the end to go and buy sweets at a reduced price, because he went to the shopkeeper saying, I've got all this money. Can I have a discount? And the shopkeeper says, well, if you buy enough, yes, of course. And wow, yeah, here we are. He showed his cousins how the advantages of saving, just knowing how to save and how to wait, was just wonderful. Absolutely wonderful. He put all the others to shame. But there was poor Julia. And what did she do? Because at the end of the year, she had nothing. But she had a scheme. She had nothing at the end of the year. In fact, she didn't even have any lollies during the year. And everyone just laughed at her and said, what have you done? You're a disaster. You couldn't manage even to save anything. But Julia had a plan, and it involved a lot time longer than 12 months. So the scheme obviously continued year after year. And then one year, Julia surprised everyone by turning up at the grandparents' house with a whole lot of money and a violin. Now, everyone knew that Julia adored the violin, but the family couldn't afford to pay for any lessons. So what Julia did, she took her coins each month and went down to the park where there was a busker. And she asked him, will you teach me to play? And she offered him the coin. And the busker said, well, this is not enough. But since you're so keen to learn, I'm going to do it for your coin. And he taught her how to play. And soon she was playing and joining the busker and earning lots of money. And in fact, at the end of several years, she had earned quite a lot of money busking. And enough to buy her own violin. And in the end, the family saw that she had done the best of all. In fact, she went on to become a very famous violinist and very wealthy. How's this possible? It's with just a few coins, well spent, you can make your wildest dreams a reality. See you next week.